The winter of 1960 did not merely arrive in Harlem, it invaded. It descended from the north like a conquering, invisible army, freezing the Hudson River at its jagged edges and turning the wide, bustling sidewalks of 125th Street into treacherous sheets of dirty, cracked glass. The wind howled through the narrow brick alleys, a high, biting, relentless whistle that sliced effortlessly through heavy wool overcoats and rattled the frosted window panes of the historic brownstones. It was a vicious, unforgiving cold. It was the kind of absolute zero that forced proud men to walk with their heads tucked low and their shoulders hunched tight against their ears. It was the kind of cold that cleared the street corners of the small-time hustlers, the jive talkers, and the numbers runners, leaving the avenues abandoned, silent, and draped in a heavy, freezing gray fog. But in the underworld, where the currency is blood and secrets, the freezing cold is just another type of cover. It is a blanket under which the rats feel bold enough to scurry. Across the Harlem River, miles away from the aristocratic elegance of Strivers Row, tucked deep inside a smoke-filled, claustrophobic basement club in the Bronx, a man named Tommy Spinelli was staring at a grease-stained map of Manhattan. They called him Tommy the Razor, a nickname earned not from any particular surgical precision, but from a crude, sloppy incident involving a barber shop and a bad debt a decade prior. Spinelli was a man who possessed a highly volatile, exceptionally dangerous combination of unchecked ambition and profound, staggering ignorance. He looked at the map of Harlem, with its meticulously drawn territorial lines, and he did not see a living, breathing community. He did not see a complex, delicate ecosystem governed by strict codes of respect, honor, and severe consequence. He just saw money. He saw the immensely lucrative numbers racket, the thick envelopes of protection money, the booming jazz clubs, the after-hours joints, and the pure, uncut, overflowing revenue streaming straight into the tailored pockets of exactly one man, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Spinelli had convinced himself, through a toxic mixture of cheap Italian wine and the sycophantic whispering of his lackeys, that the undisputed king of Harlem was finally slipping. The major Italian families downtown were currently putting heavy, sustained pressure on Bumpy's southern borders. They were squeezing his territories in a slow, grinding bureaucratic turf war over distribution routes and union kickbacks. Spinelli, sitting in his dimly lit, damp basement, listening to his own inflated ego echo off the cracking concrete walls, figured Bumpy was entirely distracted. He figured the great lion of Uptown was looking south, entirely blind to the hungry, desperate jackals sneaking up through the frost from the north. Spinelli believed the era of Bumpy Johnson was ending. He believed it was time for new blood. But attempting to take out Bumpy Johnson in a straight, honest street fight was tantamount to jumping off the George Washington Bridge with concrete shoes. Spinelli, for all his foolishness, knew that much. Bumpy was far too insulated, far too intelligent, and permanently surrounded by men like Junie Bird, men who did not issue warnings, men who did not negotiate, men who simply made you disappear into the foundation of a new high-rise. So, Spinelli concocted a strategy that bypassed the soldiers and the fortresses. It was a plan that violated the oldest, most sacred unspoken law of the criminal streets. He was not going to attack Bumpy's lucrative businesses. He was not going to ambush his lieutenants. He was going to attack his heart. He was going to take Elise. Leverage is a fascinating, terrifying psychological tool in the criminal world. Some supposedly hardened men fold the very instant you put a gun to the head of their family. They weep, They surrender their hidden ledgers. They abdicate their hard-won thrones just to see their loved ones breathe for one more day. Spinelli, a man incapable of understanding true discipline, believed Bumpy was just a man like any other, and all men, when squeezed in the right place, have a breaking point.
The plan was crude, simple, and utterly, catastrophically foolish. A midnight raid on the Johnson family brownstone. 4 heavy hitters, men built like brick walls, armed with heavy iron crowbars, chloroform rags, and silenced automatics. In and out in exactly 5 minutes. They would bypass the heavy security, drag the young girl out of her warm bed and into the freezing night, stash her in a derelict Bronx meatpacking warehouse, and wait by the rotary telephone for the King of Harlem to formally surrender his crown.
What Tommy the Razor Spinelli did not understand, what absolutely no one who ever went up against Bumpy Johnson understood until it was far, far too late, was that Bumpy did not just rule Harlem. He breathed it. He felt every subtle vibration on the pavement. He heard the whispers before they were even spoken. At 9 o'clock that evening, the vibrant warmth inside the legendary Red Rooster restaurant was a stark, almost disorienting contrast to the bitter, lethal cold waiting just outside its polished wooden doors. The air inside the dining room was thick, heavy, and rich, with the savory smell of roasted duck, the sharp tang of expensive, aged bourbon, and the sweet, heavy, intoxicating smoke of imported Cuban cigars. In the corner of the room, on a small elevated stage, a sharply dressed jazz quartet was playing a slow, mournful tune. The upright bass thumped a hypnotic, deliberate rhythm that seemed to match the collective heartbeat of the powerful men occupying the booths. Bumpy Johnson sat in his usual, permanently reserved booth in the far back corner, his back to the solid brick wall, his sharp, calculating eyes facing the front entrance. He wore a stunning, midnight blue worsted wool suit, perfectly, flawlessly tailored to his broad shoulders, paired with a crisp, brilliant white shirt that caught the dim amber light of the overhead Tiffany lamps. His signature fedora rested gently on the white tablecloth beside a heavy crystal glass of ice water. He was not drinking liquor tonight. His mind was too active. His instincts were humming. He was in the middle of a highly delicate, heavily coded conversation with 2 high-ranking downtown associates regarding the upcoming dock unloads. His face was an absolute mask of polite, terrifying indifference. He was nodding slowly, projecting the aura of a businessman mildly bored by the arithmetic of millions of dollars. Then, the air in the room seemed to subtly shift. Junie Byard materialized from the dense shadows near the kitchen's swinging doors. Junie did not walk, he simply appeared, a massive, terrifyingly solid man who moved with the eerie, unnatural silence of a stalking panther. Junie glided across the crowded dining room, his heavy overcoat swaying, his face completely devoid of any readable human emotion. He approached Bumpy's booth, leaned his massive frame down, and whispered exactly 3 tight, urgent sentences into Bumpy's right ear. The jazz music continued to play, the saxophone whining a high, lonely note. The white-coated waiters continued to carry heavy silver trays of food across the busy room. The Italian men sitting across the table continued to talk, uninterrupted, about percentage points and corrupt union fees. Bumpy Johnson did not blink. He did not frown. He did not tense his shoulders. His resting heart rate did not elevate by a single, solitary beat. He reached out with a steady, perfectly manicured hand, picked up his glowing cigar from the center crystal ashtray, and took a slow, deep, incredibly deliberate drag. He let the thick blue smoke curl lazily past his lips, watching it dance and dissipate in the low light. To the men sitting across from him, to the entire crowded restaurant, He looked exactly like a man thoughtfully pondering a minor, insignificant business concession. Inside his mind, however, the temperature of Bumpy Johnson's soul had just plummeted to absolute zero. The businessman vanished. The general awoke. "Gentlemen," Bumpy said, his voice as smooth and rich as heavy velvet, effortlessly slicing through the man speaking across from him. "I find myself suddenly, unavoidably required elsewhere. We will conclude this arithmetic tomorrow afternoon." He did not wait for their confused, slightly insulted responses. He did not offer an apology. He simply stood up in one fluid, powerful motion, placed his fedora carefully on his head, and walked toward the front exit. Junie Bard followed exactly one step behind, a silent, looming mountain of violence. Once they were safely sealed in the cavernous back seat of the idling Lincoln Continental, the heavy, armored doors slamming shut and entirely cutting off the howling, freezing wind, Bumpy finally spoke. The heater was blasting, but the air between the two men felt colder than the street outside. "Tell me again, Junie." "Every word." "One of Spinelli's regular drivers has a mouth that moves considerably faster than his brain," Junie said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in the tight space. "He was buying drinks, bragging to a coat check girl at the Apollo half an hour ago, trying to act like a big shot. Said by tomorrow morning, the Bronx is going to own all of Harlem because they're taking the princess tonight. 4 men, heavy gear, hitting the brownstone at 3 a.m. sharp." Bumpy stared out the thick, tinted window at the passing streetlights. The golden glow rhythmically illuminated the sharp, handsome, utterly merciless planes of his face. He was a man who intimately understood the deep psychological mechanics of warfare. He knew, with absolute certainty, that when a rival crosses a line of this unforgivable magnitude, you do not simply stop them. You do not simply defend your walls and call it a victory. You must make an example. You must craft a retaliation so horrifying, so deeply, psychologically devastating, that the mere whispered story of it will echo through the underground clubs and back alleys for the next 50 years. You must ensure that no one ever looks at your family again without feeling a cold shiver of mortal dread. "Are we moving Elise to the Waldorf?" Junie asked, his massive hand casually resting on the checkered grip of the heavy revolver hidden inside his coat. "I can have the penthouse suite completely locked down in 20 minutes. I can put 50 armed men on the perimeter, block the elevators, secure the roof." "No," Bumpy said softly, his voice barely rising above the hum of the engine. "If we move her, if we create a spectacle, Spinelli's scouts will see the motorcade. They'll see the muscle moving. They'll realize the element of surprise is gone, and they'll call off the raid. They'll scurry back to their damp little holes in the Bronx and wait. They will wait for another night, another month, another moment of weakness." Bumpy turned his head, his eyes locking onto Junie in the rearview mirror. "I do not want them to wait. I want them to walk straight through my front door." Junie nodded slowly, a dark understanding passing between them. It was not about prevention. It was about total, absolute eradication. The heavy Lincoln pulled up silently to the curb outside the Johnson brownstone. The street was entirely abandoned, the snow falling heavier now, aggressively dusting the parked cars and fire escapes in blinding white. Bumpy stepped out, the wind immediately biting at his face, and walked up the front steps. He unlocked the heavy, reinforced oak door and stepped into the grand foyer. The house was incredibly warm. It smelled richly of polished cedar wood, and Mamie's signature, delicate floral perfume. It was a true sanctuary, a sacred, fiercely protected place where the grime, the blood, and the endless paranoia of the streets were supposed to be scrubbed entirely clean at the threshold. The sudden violent thought of cheap Bronx thugs, men who smelled of garbage and greed, tracking dirty snow, fear, and violence onto these pristine hardwood floors, ignited a cold, intensely focused fury deep within Bumpy's chest. It was a rage so pure it felt like ice. Mamie was sitting in the formal living room, reading a thick hardcover novel by the warm, golden light of a brass floor lamp. She looked up as Bumpy entered, the fabric of her elegant dress rustling softly. She was a woman of extraordinary, breathtaking grace and immense, unshakable internal strength. She knew the life. She knew the heavy, dangerous rhythm of her husband's footsteps, and right now the rhythm was terribly wrong. It was too quiet, too deliberate, too heavy. "Ellsworth?" she asked, her voice calm, carefully closing the book and setting it deliberately on the mahogany side table. Bumpy walked over to her. He did not rush. He did not show panic. He gently, lovingly placed his hand on her shoulder, feeling the warmth of her through the fabric. "Mamie, my love, I need you to go upstairs right now and pack a small overnight bag for Elise, just her warm pajamas, her toothbrush, and her school clothes for tomorrow." Mamie's sharp, intelligent eyes locked onto his. She did not ask if there was a problem. She did not raise her voice. She did not panic. She read the incredibly subtle tightness in his jawline, the absolute, unnatural stillness in his broad posture. Where is she going at this hour? She's going to spend the night with her Aunt Sarah in Brooklyn. Junie is going to drive her himself. He's going to take the back alleys all the way down. No headlights until they hit the bridge. 2 trailing cars filled with our best men will follow at a wide distance to ensure they aren't tailed by anyone. "And me?" Mamie asked, her voice perfectly steady, even though her knuckles were turning slightly white as she gripped the armrests of her chair. "You are going to stay right here, in our master bedroom," Bumpy said, his thumb gently tracing her collarbone. "You will lock the heavy iron deadbolt. You will turn on the radio to a low volume, and you will not, under any circumstances, unlock that door until you hear me knock 3 times. Do you understand me, Mamie?" Mamie stood up. She smoothed the front of her dress with elegant, steady hands. She did not argue. She knew that in rare, terrifying moments like this, her husband was not Ellsworth the loving husband. He was Bumpy Johnson, the absolute dictator of Harlem. "I will go wake her," Mamie said quietly. "I will get her ready." 10 minutes later, Elise, half asleep, confused, and tightly clutching a worn stuffed bear, was bundled into a thick winter coat, scarf, and mittens. She rubbed her tired eyes, bewildered by the sudden, urgent midnight trip. Bumpy knelt down on the rug in the hallway, bringing his imposing frame down to eye level with his daughter. He smiled, a remarkably genuine, brilliantly warm smile that flawlessly masked the catastrophic violence swirling in his mind. "Just a little midnight adventure, baby girl," Bumpy whispered smoothly, kissing her warm forehead. Aunt Sarah made a fresh, massive batch of chocolate chip cookies, and she desperately needs my smartest girl to help her eat them before they get cold. Elise nodded sleepily. Bumpy stood up and watched intently as Junie Bird gently carried the girl out the heavy back door, seamlessly slipping into the pitch-black shadows of the freezing alley, where a nondescript, heavily armored black sedan was waiting with the engine already running. Bumpy stood motionless at the frosted back window, watching until the red taillights completely disappeared into the swirling, falling snow. The house was empty now, empty of innocence at least. Bumpy slowly turned away from the window. He walked with heavy, purposeful steps up the carpeted stairs to the second floor and pushed open the door to Elise's bedroom. The room was a perfect, untouched portrait of childhood innocence. A small, white-painted vanity with an oval mirror, a neat stack of leather-bound schoolbooks on a small desk, a portable record player sitting quietly in the corner, and a large, comfortable bed covered with a heavy, deeply quilted pink duvet. The air in the room smelled softly of lavender and baby powder. Bumpy stood dead still in the doorway, his eyes sweeping the room, analyzing the physical space not as a loving father, but as a ruthless tactician preparing a battlefield. He slowly walked over to the closet. He opened the doors and pulled out 2 thick, heavy down pillows and a tightly rolled up, dense woolen blanket. He carried them to the bed. With the meticulous, obsessive precision of a master sculptor, he began to arrange the items on the mattress. He placed the pillows side by side near the headboard to simulate a torso. He laid the rolled woolen blanket vertically down the center of the mattress to simulate the length of a pair of legs. He carefully, gently pulled the thick pink duvet up over the artificial arrangement, tucking the edges in tightly around the sides to create the illusion of weight and mass. He stepped back toward the doorway and narrowed his eyes. In the dim, ambient light filtering through the frosted window pane from the buzzing street lamp outside, the lumpy shape underneath the heavy covers looked perfect. It looked exactly like a small child, deeply asleep, huddled tightly against the bitter winter chill. It was the perfect, irresistible bait. He walked silently over to the window and adjusted the heavy velvet curtains. He drew them slightly apart, just enough to intentionally allow a single, sharp sliver of pale moonlight to fall directly across the top pillow, dramatically highlighting the trap for anyone walking through the door. He knelt down and clicked on a small, decorative nightlight plugged into the baseboard, casting a warm, deceptive, inviting golden glow across the polished floorboards. As he stood up to admire his deadly handiwork, his incredibly sharp ears picked up a sound from downstairs. He heard the incredibly faint, muffled creak of the heavy front door opening and closing. He did not reach inside his coat for his weapon. He knew the frantic, uneven footfalls instantly. They were too quick, too eager, trying far too hard to be quiet and failing miserably. Frank Lucas bounded aggressively up the carpeted stairs, taking them nervously 2 at a time, his breathing shallow, ragged, and rapid. Frank had just turned 30, a hungry, desperate country boy from the backwoods of North Carolina who had arrived on the unforgiving streets of Harlem with nothing to his name but a cheap, ill-fitting suit, a thick drawl, and a desperate, burning, agonizing hunger to be somebody important. He had been running low-level errands for Bumpy's vast crew for months, driving the trailing cars, holding doors, fetching coffee, constantly trying to inject himself into the real dangerous business. Frank desperately wanted to be a gangster. He wanted the immense respect, the paralyzing fear, the custom-tailored clothes, the power. He wanted a seat at the big table. Tonight, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson had finally decided to give him a seat, but it was absolutely not the seat Frank Lucas was expecting. Frank skidded to a halt in the doorway of the child's bedroom, his eyes wide, darting around, frantically trying to take in the serene scene. He saw Bumpy standing completely motionless by the window, his hands resting casually in his suit pockets, staring back at him. "Mr. Johnson," Frank whispered loudly, his voice trembling slightly, thick with a chaotic mixture of raw adrenaline, fear, and eager nerves. I got your call at the club. I came straight over as fast as I could. Tell me who we're hitting tonight. I got my piece ready to go. Frank reached into the deep pocket of his oversized, cheap wool overcoat and forcefully yanked out a heavy, snub-nosed .38 caliber revolver, gripping the handle far too tightly, his finger dangerously close to the trigger. Bumpy looked slowly at Frank. He looked slowly at the shaking gun. He looked at the heavy beads of nervous sweat already forming on Frank's forehead, completely defying the freezing temperature outside. Frank lacked absolute discipline. He lacked the fundamental patience required to survive in this life. He was a raw, exposed nerve, a massive, unpredictable liability in any serious gunfight. But as bait, as a secondary, unexpected mechanism in a trap, he was highly useful. "Put that away, Frank," Bumpy said, his voice softer than a whisper, yet carrying the absolute crushing weight of a falling anvil. "Before you accidentally shoot yourself in the foot, bleed out, and permanently ruin my wife's expensive Persian rug." Frank blinked rapidly, deeply confused, his ego slightly bruised, but he hastily, clumsily shoved the heavy gun back into his coat pocket. I'm ready, boss. I swear to you, I'm ready to finally put in the real work for the family." "Good," Bumpy said softly, taking a slow, measured step toward the young man, "because the real work is coming here. To us. In exactly 3 hours, 4 heavily armed, incredibly desperate men from a crew in the Bronx are going to break into this house. They firmly believe my daughter is sleeping in that bed right now. They are coming to take her." Frank's wide eyes instantly darted to the bed, focusing on the lump under the pink duvet, then snapped back to Bumpy's face. The horrifying reality of the situation crashed into his brain. This was not a routine shakedown at a neighborhood bar. This was not a minor, easily settled numbers dispute in a back alley. This was a full-scale, heavily armed home invasion by professional killers. Frank swallowed hard, his prominent Adam's apple bobbing visibly in his throat. His bravado began to evaporate like water on a hot stove. We gonna ambush them in the hallway?" Frank asked, his voice shaking visibly now. "You want me taking point on the top of the stairs? Give me a shotgun, Mr. Johnson. I'll hold the line." "No," Bumpy said flatly. He slowly raised his hand and pointed a perfectly manicured, steady finger directly at the dark, narrow space beneath the child's bed. "I want you right there." Frank stared blankly at the floor. The bed was a massive, heavy, antique oak frame. The physical clearance underneath the thick box spring was barely 1.5 feet. It was pitch dark, dusty, and instantly, horrifyingly claustrophobic. Under the bed, Mr. Johnson?" "Under the bed, Frank," Bumpy repeated, his tone dropping an octave, leaving absolutely no room for any further negotiation or cowardly hesitation. "You are going to take off that ridiculous coat, and you are going to slide under there right now. And you are going to wait. When those 4 men come creeping through that door, they are going to walk straight toward the mattress. They will be entirely focused on the pink duvet. They will be looking down at the shape." Bumpy stepped even closer to Frank, invading his personal space, towering over the younger man, lowering his voice to a terrifying, commanding whisper that demanded total, unquestioning obedience. "You will not breathe loudly. You will not cough. You will not sneeze. You will not shift your weight and let the floorboards squeak. You will lie flat on your stomach in the dust and the suffocating dark, and you will wait until they are standing right next to the mattress. You will wait until the leader physically reaches out and pulls those covers back. "And then I shoot them?" Frank asked, his eyes wide with absolute terror, his hand instinctively twitching toward his pocket. "You do not fire a single shot, Frank," Bumpy said, his cold, dead eyes locking onto Frank's, practically freezing the blood in the young man's veins. "If you fire a cheap handgun blindly in my house, you might put a wild bullet in my plaster walls, or worse, you might miss entirely and hit me in the crossfire." When they violently pull those covers back and realize the bed is completely empty, they will be utterly, paralyzingly confused for exactly 1 second. In that exact, single second of pure confusion, I want you to reach out from the dark, grab the ankles of the man standing closest to you, and pull backwards with every single ounce of strength you possess. Frank looked horrified, as if Bumpy had just asked him to jump into a volcano. "Just grab his ankles? Unarmed?" "Just grab his ankles," Bumpy confirmed smoothly, stepping back. "I will handle the rest of the arithmetic. Now, get under the bed." Frank hesitated for a fraction of a terrifying second. His fragile street pride was violently wrestling with his overwhelming, rational fear of death. But the look currently fixed on Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's face was not a polite request. It was an absolute, divine decree from the god of Harlem. Defying it was a death sentence. Frank unbuttoned his heavy coat, dropped it on the floor, and immediately dropped to his hands and knees. He nervously shimmied his shoulders under the heavy, solid oak frame, the stale, ancient dust immediately tickling the inside of his nose. The physical space was incredibly tight, far tighter than it looked. The rigid wooden slats of the heavy box spring pressed uncomfortably against his shoulder blades. The polished, freezing floorboards were shockingly cold against his stomach. "Slide all the way to the dead center," Bumpy commanded from above, his voice devoid of any sympathy. Frank desperately pushed himself further back into the suffocating darkness, using his elbows to drag his body until he was perfectly concealed by the long, hanging, ruffled edges of the pink quilted duvet. He was completely trapped in a tiny wooden coffin. Now Bumpy's voice drifted down to him, calm, steady, and terrifyingly collected. "We simply wait." With a sharp, final click, the overhead lights in the bedroom were extinguished. For Frank Lucas, the next 3 hours were not merely time passing. They were an agonizing, torturous eternity spent trapped in a sensory deprivation chamber of terror. The silence inside the massive brownstone was complete, heavy, and absolute, broken only by the rhythmic, mocking ticking of the giant mahogany grandfather clock in the downstairs hallway and the frantic, deafening, rhythmic thud of his own terrified heartbeat pounding in his ears. The stagnant air trapped under the heavy bed quickly grew warm and sour, smelling strongly of old wood polish, trapped dust, and his own nervous perspiration. Every single muscle in his back and legs began to violently cramp. His extended arms ached with a dull, throbbing pain. His legs felt entirely numb from lack of circulation, but the sheer, overwhelming terror of disappointing Bumpy Johnson kept him miraculously paralyzed. He did not dare move a single millimeter. He lay there in the absolute black, his frantic mind racing through 100 different horrific scenarios. He vividly imagined the heavily armed men arriving from the Bronx. He imagined them carrying Tommy guns, carrying sawed-off shotguns, carrying switchblades. He imagined them checking under the bed first, finding him cowering like a frightened rat, and shooting him right in the face in the dark. He squeezed his eyes shut so tightly they ached, desperately trying to control his ragged breathing, taking tiny, shallow, suffocating sips of sour air so his chest wouldn't expand and scrape against the wooden bed frame above him. Directly outside the bedroom door, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson was experiencing a very, very different kind of weight. Bumpy quietly, effortlessly, pulled a large, high-backed, oxblood leather wing chair from his private study down the hall and placed it deliberately in the center of the hallway, directly opposite the wide-open door of Elise's bedroom. The hallway was entirely dark, save for the incredibly faint, ghostly ambient light filtering up the main stairwell from the streetlights shining through the glass front transom. Bumpy slowly sat down in the heavy leather chair. He rested his large hands gently on the padded armrests. He did not lazily cross his legs. He did not relax and lean back against the cushions. He sat perfectly upright, maintaining the flawless, terrifying, motionless posture of a stone gargoyle perched high on a Gothic cathedral ledge, patiently waiting for the sun to go down so it could hunt. He reached smoothly into his tailored breast pocket and withdrew a fresh, incredibly expensive imported cigar. He did not strike a match to light it. He simply held the thick, dark cylinder gently between his lips, slowly tasting the rich, unlit, earthy tobacco. He closed his eyes and let his heightened, finely tuned senses expand outward into the massive house. He listened to the bitter wind rattling the exterior window glass. He listened to the old copper pipes softly groaning deep within the plaster walls. He deliberately, methodically settled his mind into a state of absolute, pure, predatory calm. He was not a nervous homeowner waiting anxiously for violent intruders. He was a massive, deadly trapdoor spider sitting perfectly still at the very center of an intricate web, patiently, happily waiting to feel the silken threads begin to vibrate. At exactly 14 minutes past 3 o'clock in the morning, the vibration finally came. It was not a loud, crashing noise. It was a sound so incredibly faint, so incredibly delicate, that a lesser, untrained man would have instantly dismissed it as the old house naturally settling in the freezing temperatures. It was the microscopic, distinctly metallic click-snick of a brass lock tumbler being forced out of place at the heavy back kitchen door downstairs. Bumpy silently removed the unlit cigar from his lips and placed it carefully back into his breast pocket. He opened his eyes. They were completely devoid of warmth. Downstairs on the ground floor, the heavy wooden kitchen door eased open on its hinges. The freezing winter air rushed into the warm house, bringing with it the faint, unmistakable, foul smells of wet wool, cheap metallic gun oil, and terrified, nervous sweat. 4 sets of heavy, snow-caked, rubber-soled combat boots stepped heavily onto the pristine linoleum floor. Trapped under the bed upstairs, Frank Lucas heard the floorboards creak on the first floor. His eyes snapped wide open in the suffocating darkness. His stomach instantly plummeted into his shoes. The painful cramping in his numb legs miraculously vanished, instantly replaced by a massive surge of pure, icy adrenaline that made his fingers tingle. They were finally here. Sitting motionless in the dark hallway, Bumpy listened intently to their slow progress. They were moving very carefully, desperately trying to be quiet professionals, but they were incredibly clumsy. They lacked the smooth, terrifying grace of true Harlem operators. One of them blindly bumped heavily against the decorative hallway table, causing a vase to rattle slightly. Another was breathing far too heavily through his mouth, his lungs raspy from the cold. Bumpy accurately tracked their precise movements through the house simply by analyzing the auditory disruption they caused in his perfectly quiet environment. They slowly reached the bottom of the main wooden staircase. They paused. Complete silence stretched for 5 agonizing seconds. Bumpy could perfectly imagine them standing there, looking cautiously up into the pitch darkness of the second floor, gripping their heavy iron crowbars and their cocked pistols, stupidly thinking they were apex wolves creeping silently into an unguarded sheep's pen. The first heavy, snow-covered boot landed solidly on the bottom stair. Creak. Under the bed, Frank bit down on his own bottom lip hard enough to draw warm blood, desperately trying to stifle a whimpering sound building in his throat. The heavy footsteps were coming up, slow, heavy, methodical. Thump, creak, thump. Bumpy remained utterly motionless in the massive leather wing chair. He merged entirely with the deep shadows of the hallway. He became the darkness. If they had simply shined a bright flashlight up the stairs, they would have seen him sitting there like a king on a throne. But they didn't. They were relying on their failing night vision, fatally focused on the ultimate prize they believed lay sleeping helplessly in the glowing room straight ahead. The four intruders finally reached the landing at the top of the stairs. They clustered tightly together in the hallway, standing less than 10 feet away from where Bumpy sat enveloped in total darkness. He could clearly smell them now. The overpowering scent of cheap drugstore pomade, the lingering sour stench of stale beer on their breath, the sharp metallic tang of uncleaned weapons. The clear leader of the group, a massive, thick-necked man wearing a dark woolen flat cap pulled incredibly low over his eyes to hide his face, signaled silently to the others with a quick wave of his hand. He slowly raised a thick, leather-gloved finger and pointed directly at the open door of Elise's bedroom. The warm, inviting, golden glow of the small nightlight spilled gently out of the room, illuminating the wooden threshold, drawing them in like moths to an open flame. The four men moved silently toward the door, their weapons drawn, hammers cocked back. The massive leader boldly stepped over the threshold and into the bedroom. Underneath the bed, Frank Lucas watched in sheer, paralyzed terror as a pair of massive, snow-crusted, heavy leather boots suddenly entered his narrow field of vision. They stopped abruptly, planting firmly on the rug just inches away from his sweating face. Frank immediately stopped breathing. He could literally feel the immense weight of the man pressing down heavily on the floorboards right beside him. He saw the other 3 pairs of boots shuffle quietly into the room right behind the leader, fanning out aggressively around the perimeter of the bedroom to secure the area. The leader stood tall over the bed, looking straight down at the lumpy shape sleeping soundly under the pink duvet. He deliberately reached out with his left hand, his right hand gripping the heavy iron crowbar so tightly his leather gloves creaked in the silence. In the dark hallway, sitting completely unseen in the shadows, Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson leaned slightly forward in the leather chair, every single muscle in his powerful body coiling tight, violently ready to unspring. The heavy, snow-dampened leather glove clamped firmly onto the top edge of the pink-quilted duvet. Time in the child's bedroom instantly ceased to move at its normal, predictable pace. For Frank Lucas, trapped in the suffocating, dust-choked darkness beneath the heavy oak bed frame, the next 3 seconds expanded into an agonizing, terrifying hour. He could hear the raspy breathing of the massive man standing directly above him. He could smell the cheap tobacco deeply embedded in the intruder's wet wool coat. He could see the thick, aggressively scuffed heels of the man's combat boots planted firmly on the Persian rug, less than 6 inches from his trembling nose. The leader of the Bronx crew did not hesitate. He was a man accustomed to taking what he wanted through sheer, blunt force. He tightened his grip on the soft pink fabric, heavily braced his thick legs, and aggressively yanked the heavy duvet completely back. The sound of the thick bedding tearing through the freezing, stagnant air was deafening in the absolute silence of the brownstone. The leader stood completely frozen, his right arm still raised, the heavy iron crowbar tightly gripped in his fist, ready to strike down anyone who dared to interfere. But there was no one to strike. His narrowed, predatory eyes adjusted to the sudden rush of pale moonlight flooding the exposed mattress. He stared at the arrangement. He blinked rapidly, his brain struggling to process the visual information. There was no terrified, screaming little girl. There was no leverage. There were only two plump, perfectly arranged down pillows and a tightly rolled, coarse woolen blanket lying vertically down the exact center of the mattress. In that microscopic, infinitely terrifying fraction of a second, a profound, chilling realization washed over the Bronx leader. It was a physical sensation, cold and sharp as a butcher's knife, starting at the base of his thick neck and shivering down his spine. He realized he was not the hunter. He had never been the hunter. He realized he had proudly, arrogantly marched his men straight into a meticulously designed, inescapable cage. The profound silence of the house suddenly did not feel like the silence of a sleeping family. It felt like the heavy, suffocating silence of a drawn breath before a massive execution. "What the?" the leader whispered, his voice cracking, stripped of its former bravado. He took a single, uncertain half-step backward, completely disoriented, the heavy crowbar lowering slightly by his side. Underneath the bed, Frank Lucas felt the divine truth of Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson's mathematical prediction. Bumpy had precisely calculated this exact, singular moment of profound human confusion. He had predicted the hesitation. Frank did not think. He did not weigh the consequences. He simply reacted with the desperate, explosive energy of a cornered animal fighting for its life. Frank fiercely lunged forward from the suffocating darkness. He shot both of his long, muscular arms out from under the ruffled pink skirt of the bed. His large, sweating hands violently clamped down onto the thick, rigid leather of the leader's combat boots, his long fingers desperately digging into the coarse material precisely at the ankles. The leader gasped, a sharp, horrific sound of pure shock. He looked down, his eyes widening in sheer terror, as two disembodied arms suddenly burst from the pitch-black shadows beneath the bed like demonic tentacles. Before the massive man could attempt to swing the heavy iron crowbar, before he could physically articulate a warning shout to his three armed companions standing completely unaware in the room behind him, Frank Lucas pulled. He pulled backward with absolutely every single ounce of terrifying, desperate strength he possessed in his young, powerful frame. He used the heavy wooden crossbeams of the bed frame for leverage, planting his shoulders and yanking the man's heavy legs out from under him. The fundamental physics of the surprise attack were devastating. The massive leader, weighing well over 250 pounds, completely lost his center of gravity. He fell backward, completely rigid, like a felled redwood tree in a forest. The impact of his massive body hitting the polished hardwood floor was cataclysmic. It sounded like a heavy bank safe being dropped from a second-story window. The back of the leader's skull aggressively cracked against the solid floorboards with a sickening, wet thud that instantly rattled the glass in the window panes. The heavy iron crowbar flew wildly from his loosened grip, shattering the large mirror of the small white vanity in the corner with a deafening crash of falling glass. Total chaos instantly erupted within the confined space of the child's bedroom. The remaining 3 Bronx thugs, shocked by the sudden disappearance of their leader and the explosive noise, spun around in the darkness. They aggressively raised their heavy pistols, their fingers nervously twitching on the hair triggers, frantically searching the deep shadows for a visible target. They were thoroughly panicked, their uncoordinated movements entirely driven by blind fear. "Tommy, what happened? Where are they?" One of the thugs screamed into the darkness, his voice pitching high with raw panic, his heavy gun sweeping wildly across the empty room, dangerously close to firing blindly into the walls. They entirely forgot to check the open doorway behind them. That was their final, fatal mistake. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson did not announce his arrival. He did not shout a dramatic, intimidating warning. He did not wildly fire a cheap handgun into the chaotic darkness. He moved from the deep, enveloping shadows of the dark hallway with the terrifying, unnatural speed and flawless precision of a striking cobra. He was a man who had survived the absolute worst, most violent penal colony on the face of the earth. He had fought off hardened, desperate killers in the freezing, blood-slicked shower blocks of Alcatraz with a sharpened spoon. These deeply unorganized, panicked, amateur street thugs from the Bronx were out of their depth. They were children attempting to wrestle a silverback gorilla in the dark. Bumpy seamlessly crossed the wooden threshold of the bedroom. He held a heavy, custom-made, lead-filled leather sap tightly in his right hand. It was an elegant, brutal, efficient weapon, favored by the old-school enforcers because it broke dense bone without making a dramatic sound. The first thug, a tall, incredibly nervous man wearing a cheap fedora, was backing up toward the hallway, his trembling gun pointed uselessly at the shattered vanity mirror. He never even felt the displacement of air as Bumpy stepped directly behind him. Bumpy did not hesitate. He expertly raised the leather sap and brought it down with calculated surgical force, striking the man precisely on the soft, vulnerable nerve cluster located directly behind his right ear. There was no drawn-out fight. There was only a sharp, sickening crack of yielding bone and cartilage. The tall man's central nervous system shut down instantly. His eyes rolled back into his head, his jaw went slack, and he crumpled silently to the floorboards like a discarded marionette whose strings had been abruptly severed by a razor blade. Bumpy reached out with his left hand, smoothly catching the man's falling pistol before it could hit the ground and discharge, casually slipping the weapon into his own tailored suit pocket in one fluid motion. 2 left. The sound of the first man falling to the floor alerted the other 2 thugs. They spun toward the dark doorway, their eyes wide with sheer terror, desperately trying to penetrate the deep shadows. "Who's there? Show yourself, you jive cat." The second thug screamed, aggressively raising his heavy automatic pistol, trying to aim at the phantom moving seamlessly in the darkness. Bumpy did not stop moving. He understood the complex geometry of a confined gunfight. He used the ambient darkness as his most trusted ally. He dropped low to the floor, seamlessly sliding under the panicked man's erratic line of sight, closing the distance between them in a fraction of a second. Before the nervous thug could even realize his target had vanished from his eye line, Bumpy forcefully drove his left shoulder into the man's midsection with the unstoppable force of a runaway freight train. The impact drove the oxygen from the thug's lungs in a violent rush. As the man instinctively doubled over in agonizing pain, gasping for air, Bumpy brought the heavy leather sap aggressively upward in a short, brutal arc, connecting directly with the bottom of the man's jaw. The horrific sound of the lower jawbone shattering echoed loudly in the small room. The thug flipped completely backward, his heavy gun clattering uselessly across the floorboards, knocked unconscious before his broad shoulders even hit the Persian rug. One left. The final man, a heavily built enforcer clutching a sawed-off, double-barreled shotgun, was paralyzed by absolute fear. In less than 5 seconds, his entire heavily armed crew had been completely dismantled by an unseen ghost. He stood shaking near the broken vanity, the heavy barrel of his shotgun visibly trembling, wildly pointing it in every direction. He was hyperventilating, entirely trapped in a nightmare he could not wake up from. Bumpy slowly, deliberately stood up to his full, imposing height. He no longer needed the cover of the deep shadows. He simply stepped forward into the pale, cold stream of moonlight, cutting through the drawn velvet curtains. He stood perfectly still. His tailored, expensive midnight blue suit was immaculate, undisturbed by the physical exertion. He casually adjusted his expensive fedora with his left hand. His face was an unreadable, terrifying mask of cold, predatory calm. He looked directly into the terrified, wide eyes of the final thug. "You are shaking, son," Bumpy said. His rich, deeply resonant voice was completely smooth, entirely devoid of anger, entirely devoid of stress. It was the calm, terrifying voice of a judge casually reading a final, inescapable execution order. That is an exceptionally heavy weapon you are holding. If your sweaty finger accidentally slips on that hair trigger, you are going to permanently ruin my daughter's favorite wallpaper, and I assure you, you do not want to see what I will be forced to do to you if you ruin her beautiful wallpaper. The young, heavily built thug stared deeply at the King of Harlem. He looked at the heavy, lead-filled sap, loosely dripping with blood in Bumpy's right hand. He looked at the deeply unconscious bodies of his dangerous friends casually strewn across the floor like discarded, broken toys. He realized, with terrifying clarity, that the shotgun clutched in his sweaty hands was utterly useless. The man standing before him was not a simple target. He was an elemental force of nature. The thug slowly, carefully swallowed the metallic taste of fear pooling in his dry mouth. His trembling hands slowly opened. The heavy, sawed-off shotgun dropped to the floor with a loud clatter. The thug instantly dropped to his knees, raising his shaking hands in the air, completely surrendering to the god of the underworld. "Smart boy," Bumpy whispered smoothly. Without breaking eye contact, Bumpy casually nudged the dropped weapons under the desk with his polished shoe, well out of reach of the sleeping crew. He slowly, methodically walked over to the small decorative lamp resting on the desk and clicked the switch. The room was instantly flooded with warm, revealing light, stripping away the terrifying shadows and exposing the devastation of the sudden ambush. The child's bedroom resembled a chaotic war zone. The vanity mirror was shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The pink duvet was tangled on the floor. 3 incredibly dangerous, heavily armed men lay completely incapacitated across the rug. Underneath the heavy oak bed, Frank Lucas slowly, cautiously peeked his head out from under the ruffled skirt. He was covered in thick gray dust, his expensive suit ruined, his young face pale and streaked with nervous sweat. He stared at the unbelievable scene unfolding above him with unadulterated awe. He had never in his entire life seen a man dismantle a hit squad with such cold, flawless precision. Bumpy deliberately walked over to the massive leader of the crew, who was currently lying flat on his back near the foot of the bed. The heavy man was slowly groaning, his eyes fluttering open, his massive hands instinctively reaching up to clutch the swelling lump forming on the back of his thick skull. The devastating impact from the fall had severely concussed him, stripping away his aggressive coordination. Bumpy smoothly pulled the small wooden desk chair to the center of the room. He sat down, casually crossing his right leg over his left knee. He carefully reached into his tailored breast pocket, slowly withdrawing the expensive, unlit cigar he had placed there hours ago. He placed it gently between his teeth. He calmly retrieved a sleek silver lighter from his vest pocket, flipped it open, and struck the flint. The flame brightly illuminated his sharp features as he deliberately took a deep drag, letting the thick, sweet blue smoke curl out of his nose. He looked down at the heavily concussed leader, attempting to sit up on the rug. "You must be Tommy Spinelli's boy," Bumpy stated casually, waving the silver lighter in the air to extinguish the flame before sliding it back into his pocket. "I can smell the cheap, imported Bronx garbage on your coat from all the way over here." The leader blinked, aggressively trying to focus his blurred vision. He looked up, confused, staring at the perfectly dressed man sitting comfortably in the chair above him. The terrifying reality of his catastrophic failure slowly dawned on his damaged brain. He looked around the brilliantly lit room, seeing his men lying broken and bleeding on the Persian rug. "You," the leader stammered, his thick voice slurring, attempting to sit up completely, but his equilibrium failed him, forcing him back down onto his elbows. "You knew. You set us up. I allowed you to forcefully enter my private home," Bumpy corrected him, his voice dangerously soft, leaning forward in the wooden chair, resting his sharp elbows on his knees. "I allowed you to loudly trample up my clean stairs with your dirty boots. I allowed you to walk into my daughter's private sanctuary. I permitted this profound disrespect because I desperately needed to visually illustrate a crucial lesson in basic geography to your arrogant, deeply foolish boss." Bumpy took another slow, deliberate drag of the glowing cigar. The thick smoke hung in the air, creating a suffocating atmosphere over the defeated men. "Tommy the Razor firmly believes he is a strategic thinker," Bumpy continued smoothly, his eyes locked onto the leader's terrified face, refusing to let him look away. "Tommy believes he can aggressively squeeze my southern borders, distract my best men with trivial union disputes, and sneak thugs through my front door to desperately steal the only thing in this world that actually matters to me." Bumpy stood up from the chair. He seamlessly walked over to the leader, towering above him like a dark monument. He tapped the glowing ash from his cigar onto the center of the man's chest. The hot ash burned right through the wet fabric of the coat, causing the leader to violently flinch, but Bumpy's polished shoe pinned the man's wrist firmly to the floorboard, preventing him from moving away. "Tommy Spinelli is not a strategic thinker," Bumpy said softly, applying significantly more downward pressure with his shoe, causing the leader to grimace in deep pain. "Tommy is a deeply arrogant, highly ignorant amateur playing a foolish game he does not understand. You came into my home to take my daughter, to use her as cheap leverage. That is not simply a business dispute. That is a permanent, irredeemable violation of the natural order." Frank Lucas finally crawled out from underneath the bed. He brushed the thick, suffocating dust from his ruined suit, coughing slightly. He stood nervously behind Bumpy, quietly watching the master interrogate the utterly broken thug. Frank realized that he was receiving an advanced masterclass in power. True power was not violently screaming or waving guns. True power was sitting calmly in a wooden chair, smoking a cigar, while watching your deeply terrified enemies bleed on your rug. "Please, Mr. Johnson," the leader begged, his thick voice cracking with sheer fear, realizing he was at the absolute mercy of a man completely devoid of it. "We were ordered. Tommy explicitly told us the house would be entirely empty. We didn't want any major trouble. You brought the trouble to my front door." Bumpy softly interrupted, his voice incredibly smooth, cutting through the man's desperate excuses like a scalpel. "But you are incredibly fortunate tonight. I am a civilized, generous man. I refuse to stain my wife's favorite rug any further with your cheap blood. I am going to allow you to walk out of my house." The leader's eyes widened in absolute shock. You're letting us go?" "I am letting you leave," Bumpy corrected smoothly, "because I desperately need a reliable, living messenger. You are going to gather your deeply broken, unconscious friends. You are going to physically carry them down my stairs, carefully ensuring you do not scratch my polished banister. You are going to tightly pack them into your cheap car, and you are going to drive back across the freezing river to the Bronx." Bumpy leaned down, bringing his handsome, terrifying face inches away from the leader's sweating face. The smell of the rich cigar mixed with the sharp scent of raw fear. "And when you finally arrive at that damp, miserable little basement club," Bumpy whispered intensely, every syllable dripping with venom, "you are going to stand before Tommy Spinelli. You are going to look him directly in his eyes, and you are going to explicitly tell him that the King of Harlem sends his profound regards. You will inform him that if he ever, in his miserable life, sends another armed man into my private territory, I will not simply defend my borders. I will personally cross the freezing river. I will burn his entire organization to the ground, and I will personally feed his ambitious heart to the stray dogs starving in the alleyways." Bumpy stood back up, smoothing the front of his perfect suit. "Do you understand the exact arithmetic of my message?" The leader nodded violently, tears of panic and relief streaming down his bruised face. "Yes, Mr. Johnson, I understand every single word, I swear to you." "Good," Bumpy said. He casually gestured to the open door with his cigar. "You have exactly 5 uninterrupted minutes to remove this garbage from my daughter's bedroom before I profoundly change my generous mind." The terrified enforcer who had surrendered his shotgun scrambled quickly from his knees. He rushed over to help his concussed leader to his feet. Together, they grabbed their unconscious companions by the collars of their heavy coats, dragging them desperately out of the brilliantly lit bedroom and down the hallway stairs, frantic to escape the terrifying nightmare they had stumbled into. Bumpy Johnson did not even look back to watch them flee. He calmly turned around and faced Frank Lucas. Frank was still trembling. He stood in the center of the ruined room, surrounded by shattered glass and broken furniture. He looked at Bumpy with an expression of profound, terrified reverence. He realized that everything he thought he knew about the dangerous streets, everything he thought he understood about sheer toughness, was completely wrong. "Mr. Johnson," Frank stuttered, struggling to find the right words. I grabbed him right when you said to. I pulled him down." Bumpy looked at the young man. He saw the raw, unfiltered ambition burning brightly in Frank's wide eyes, but he also saw the profound, newly discovered fear. It was a deeply necessary, crucial education for a young hustler. "You did exactly what you were explicitly told to do, Frank," Bumpy said smoothly, his voice returning to its normal, rich tone. You did not panic. You did not scream. You held your absolute ground in the pitch dark. That requires a specific, rare kind of nerve. Bumpy slowly walked over to Frank, placing a heavy, reassuring hand firmly on the young man's trembling shoulder. But I deeply need you to understand the crucial lesson of tonight, Frank, Bumpy stated softly, looking deeply into the young man's soul. Any foolish, arrogant jive cat can purchase a cheap gun. Any desperate thug can kick open a locked door in the pitch dark. That is simply noise. It is chaotic weakness pretending to be strength. Bumpy slowly swept his hand around the devastated room. True, absolute, unbreakable power is having your arrogant enemies do your crucial work for you. It is making them walk voluntarily into your prepared trap, terrified to ever cross you again, because they realize you saw them coming from 1,000 miles away. Frank nodded slowly, absorbing the profound philosophy. I understand, Mr. Johnson. It's about always being one massive step ahead. Exactly, Bumpy agreed smoothly. Now I suggest you quietly exit through the back kitchen door before my lovely wife emerges from her private locked bedroom to survey this offensive, catastrophic mess. Frank nodded respectfully, quickly turning and hastily exiting the devastated bedroom, desperate to successfully escape into the freezing, dark night, forever changed by the masterful display of absolute power. Bumpy Johnson stood alone in the severely damaged room. He took one incredibly long, final deep drag from his expensive cigar, deliberately blowing the thick blue smoke out the frosted open window into the freezing night air. He slowly, methodically walked out of the room, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him. He walked down the completely dark hallway and stopped in front of the master bedroom door. He slowly, deliberately raised his right hand and calmly knocked precisely 3 times. The heavy iron deadbolt clicked loudly. The door slowly opened, revealing Mamie Johnson standing there, completely unbothered, her eyes scanning his immaculate suit for a single drop of blood. Finding none, she simply nodded. The trap had sprung. The lesson was violently delivered, and the King of Harlem was finally ready to go to bed.
Thanks for listening, folks. If you liked that video and want more, be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss any Bumpy Johnson stories.